We just had the latest developer update video go live for Marvel Snap, which confirmed the new cards that are going to be added next season. So I wanted to take a look at them and give my final ratings for them before they launch. So just a quick note before we go into any of the card ratings, we have a new ability in Marvel Snap with this new season in Activate. Activate is going to be essentially be a delayed on reveal. So you play the card out, you can activate that ability starting from that next turn all the way up until the last turn of the game, but you have to have it staged first before you can utilize the activate. And so this is interesting from a deck design standpoint, but where I'm a little bit reserved is that it also becomes relatively telegraphed. You won't have as much of a surprise factor for the opponent because they're going to know what your activate could be. And so they can get a pretty good game plan of what you're planning to do on those final couple of turns. And so I'm pretty excited to see what activate does to the game. Hopefully it shakes it up in a very healthy way, but we'll see. So the first one that we have is Symbiote Spider. Symbiote Spider is a 4-cost, 6-power with the activate ability, merge your lowest cost card here with this, and then you copy its text like it just revealed. So this is an interesting design space, which I think is really interesting. It has a lot of cool applications potentially, but we also know that the 4-cost slot for cards is the hardest one to hit and get right. And so at 4 cost, 6 power, if you don't have a solid on reveal that you're hitting, could make it kind of tough to get good value out of the card. I could see some kind of interesting lines with like a Black Panther. You play a Black Panther into the lane that you have Symbiote Spider, you activate it going into turn number 6, and then you play like a Taskmaster. And then all of a sudden you have an absurd amount of power in 2 lanes. And that's just the first one that kind of comes to my mind. You could also do it with some lower value on reveals to try to get some cool interactions going. The biggest thing that I think that this will be susceptible to is Shadow King. Since it is like a symbiote, or I think for this case, like the Phoenix Force, it will be able to have that power reduced back to that base card, which I think could limit its potential a fair amount. And so as far as the design, I think this is a really interesting card design. I'm going to give it 4 out of 5 stars because I think it's something that could create a brand new deck all by itself. It could create brand new lines and really shakes up that design space or the deck archetype space with this card just being a possibility. As far as value, like I said, the 4-cost slot is kind of tough to nail down and hit just right. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5 stars. Now, this could vary if there are some really good, consistent combos that come out from it. Typically, the 4-cost slot is the hardest to fit into a build most cohesively without really gutting a potential draw line or maybe hitting dead draws more often than not. So I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5 stars, not because I think it will be unusable, but just because I think the overall value, if you don't hit anything of note, it is just a 4/6. There could be much better cards for that same cost to power ratio. And then as far as flexibility, I'm giving it a 4 out of 5. I was torn between 3 and 4. I think this will have some cool applications for some of our very prevalent on reveals. And then I think it'll also create cool opportunities with things like Beta Ray Bill, with things like Dakin, Black Panther. Being able to elevate that power to absurd levels, I think could be pretty fun. Next up, we have Silver Sable. Silver Sable is a 1-cost, 1-power card with the on-reveal ability of steal 2 power from the top card of your opponent's deck. So this is a very similar design space to Chavez in that you play it, you get some kind of benefit to that next card. Only this time, we're negatively afflicting the opponent's card and we're gaining that power. So Silver Sable, as long as that on-reveal can trigger, is going to start at a base of 1/3, which is pretty solid. And it's potentially going to afflict the opponent with that -2 if they play that card. So around a 1/5 that you're just playing, you don't have the negative deficit of like a Martyr or of a Bob that can jump around the board. I think it's going to be an incredibly valuable card. I think the design of the card itself is okay. I think it's probably the least exciting of the cards that are going to be releasing this season, but I still think it's a 3 out of 5 because it's a cool ability. Even if you don't end up doing bounce style stuff, it could be a decent value and disruption to the opponent. As far as value goes, it is a 1/3 at worst, a 1/5 for a single play at best if the opponent plays that negatively afflicted card. So as far as value for that 1-cost slot, I'm going to say it's a 4 out of 5. Other 1/5s that we're competing with are Hydra Bob, Titania, Martyr. All of those have serious drawbacks. And then a 1/3 with no deficit, potentially 1/5 impact is really good value for the 1-cost slot. And then as far as flexibility, I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5. Because yes, you can use it in just about any deck because it is a lower cost. But as far as is it going to be the best thing you could do, most of the time those 1-cost cards are reserved for really high impact cards or for bounce style decks. So, a bounce style decks, you have much more flexibility in how many one cost cards you can play. I think this card fits amazingly into any kind of bounce shell that wants to run Falcon, Beast, or any other card that can pull those cards back in. I think she's going to excel there. But outside of that, I don't think we see her slotted into a vast majority of decks. And so, as far as flexibility, I think she kind of fits into that niche of the bounce. Outside of that, I don't think we see a lot of play from her. And so overall, her rating is going to be 3.33 out of 5. The next card we have releasing is Madam Web. Madam Web is an understated 2 cost, coming in at 2 cost, 1 power, which is a really low value or power spread. So you know that her ability has to be strong. Her ability is ongoing. You can move one of your other cards away from here each turn. So from a design space, I think this is really interesting. It's kind of like having a Jeff at a location that can move out at any point in time. I think this is a very, very strong effect. Any kind of Professor X. Poor Professor X, he's never going to return with all of these movement things. Even if you're not running a movement deck with her, just having those cards that you can then move out of that lane later can open up so much space. So this can become a clutter deterrent for a particular lane. This can be an enabler for a lot of big movement stuff. So like a move with a Hercules. You can create some kind of crazy combos with this, I am very sure. You could do some lockjaw rotation shenanigans. Lockjaw rotation, getting the Madam Web, once that lane is filled up, you can either move a card out or move the lockjaw out and then rotate more cards. Can potentially be a crazy amount of value. So I'm interested to see all of the different deck archetypes that she works in and where she's going to fit best. I think from a design space, really cool ability, 4 out of 5. As far as value goes, she is a 2-1, so far as just raw stats, pretty bad. But as far as those like mind games for your opponent, very, very strong. Coming in at a 4 out of 5, you could potentially do Nocturne. It allows double Nocturne move. Even if you're just using her in like a good value build, it lets you reposition your cards, which makes it much more difficult for your opponent to pinpoint exactly where that power is going to fall. And so within that gives you a lot of strength and a lot of cube possibility or cube equity for being able to steal bigger cube games with those mind game components. As far as flexibility goes, another 4 out of 5. I think she's in a fantastic spot, being able to be used in Angela decks, in Spectrum ongoing decks to fill up a lane, protect from Jean Grey. Then you can move a card out so you can reposition those cards across the board wherever and however you see fit. She enables those mind game components, which is my favorite element of cards, in being able to read and make your opponent have a hard time figuring out exactly what you're going to do on that last turn, which is in turn going to make them overstay more often than not. I think she fits into several builds, even just outside of move, and so 4 out of 5 as her overall rating. The next card that we have is Arana. Arana is a 1 cost, 1 power, so another little bit understated card, but she has the activate ability. Give the next card you play +2 power and move it to the right. So she is joining the ranks of Iron Fist, of Ghost Spider. So she's going to potentially create some really big high roll opportunities. And with the activate, she won't work as well with like a beast bounce because the activates will only trigger once per game. But you can really start elevating and snowballing something like a Deadpool. Probably not as much because the movement component isn't as important, but Human Torch especially, you have the other cards that generally want that +2 power that maybe can fit in, but especially in the movement archetype niche, she's going to be very, very strong. I think that's where we'll see a lot of her early growth. And then I'd be interested to see how she finds her ways or if she can find her way into other builds later on. As far as the design, I think it's a really cool design, giving us another use of activate, and we are moving it to the right, which is one of the harder locations to move cards into. Previously, everything moved over to the left, making move very transparent, very easy to read. With the tools that we have now, it is no longer the case. Being able to move a card over to the right can be fantastic value. And so as far as value goes, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. I think both the design and value are great for the card. It very much feels like the other spider cards that we have, and it's going to create some craziness for movement decks. As far as flexibility, I'm a little bit lower on her flexibility because I don't think she'll find herself out of the archetype of move very often. Maybe she'll be able to slot into some other ones, but I think in general, movement is going to be her home. So for flexibility, I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5, which makes her overall rating a 3.6 out of 5. And then lastly, we have my personal favorite. We have Scarlet Spider. Scarlet Spider is a 4 cost, 5 power. And as I said at the start of the video, the 4 cost card slot is so difficult to balance cards for. Outside of just really strong effects, we don't see a lot of use or value from very many 4-cost cards very consistently. Just because it's harder to build your curve around, you have to drop it towards the later part of the game where you're wanting to do those big impact plays. But Scarlet Spider comes in at a 4-cost 5 power with the activate ability, add an exact clone of this to another location. And so this can create some really interesting play lines. If we even just take away any of the power up effects at all, if we were just looking at 4-5, 4-5 with the ability to copy into another lane is a 4-10. I think that's a pretty standard 4-cost card that is played without any kind of restriction. If you're going Cull Obsidian, which is the 4-10, you have to play it into a lane that already has a 1-cost card. For Crossbones, you have to be winning that location. For Scarlet Spider, the only restriction essentially is that you play it before the last turn of the game so that you can utilize that activate ability. And then if you start adding in the Shuris, if you start adding in Gwynpool, Forge, all of these different things that can really elevate that Scarlet Spider, we might end up having a pretty cheeky Gwynpool, Black Panther style build with these cards. And I think Scarlet Spider is at the base of it. Being able to have that buffed up to a 4-8 and then spread it across gives you a 4-16. Very interesting design, being able to impact a separate lane, even outside of playing there directly, which I think is kind of cool. It can help you reach some of those harder to play into locations. As far as the design goes, 4 out of 5, very fun ability. I think it creates or reinvigorates a deck archetype that is maybe lesser played, and so it definitely has a cool design appeal. As far as value, I'm going to say 4 out of 5. I was leaning closer to 5, but the restriction of having to have it in your hand, you couldn't get lucky and top deck it at the end of the game, definitely holds it back a little bit, and you may need some enablers to make it really worthwhile. I'm going to say 4 out of 5 for value. As far as flexibility, I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5. At one point, I was even considering 5 out of 5, but the 4-cost card slot is so difficult to get right. And it could be that it's more hassle than it's worth because you have to drop it on turn 4 or 5 to get that ability. And so it's a little bit less flexible. You can't get lucky and top deck it at the end of the game and then have an explosive play. You would be restricted to only having that one copy rather than being able to get it into that second lane. And so overall, a 3.6 out of 5. I'm excited about a lot of these cards. I'm excited about the activate ability, but with any kind of new ability with these stat lines, 4-cost historically has been really tough. So I'm very reserved on where I think they're going to fall in terms of effectiveness. But either way, I think they're going to be very strong as we see them come into the game. And I'm going to be interested to see how each one impacts the meta. And I think we're in for a very interesting season.